And I got a few more service-based stories for any of you guys and gals that happen to be interested. And I really appreciate you tuning in to my channel. And so I'm going to go ahead and get started here. This is really there's several vehicles I'm talking about in here. But there's times when it seems like, I don't know if you've had a day like that, when nothing seems to go right. It's that no matter what you do, everything tends to blow up in your face. And sometimes, and just about every time that's ever happened, you just got to keep on plugging. You know, some vehicles, about the time you feel like you're going to get them out of your service bay, they get their hooks into you and they pull themselves back in. And so I could tell a lot of stories about that, but I'm just going to jump into these. This is a 2005 Sportage that I was going to mention here. It's kind of an example of people that wing it. I used to tell my students whenever they're getting ready to do a job, don't just jump into the job without looking at the shop manual to see how it's supposed to be done. This one here needed the engine swapped out, and I gave it to one of my students who was he's kind of a big old country boy, and he had done some mechanic work at home, and he was used to pulling engines out the old-fashioned way, you know, maybe parking it under a tree and using a chain fall to pull it out. He tried to pull the engine out of this Kia the same way, with me telling him, you need to check the shop manual before you do any of this. And he wouldn't pay any attention. You know, of course, I just let them learn, and they don't really hurt anything, you know, that they cost themselves a bunch of extra work, but we had the time. So he goes trying to pull this thing out. He gets it disconnected from the transaxle, and then he realizes that it won't go. And I think, as I remember right, it was a manual transmission too, transaxle. He couldn't get the engine disengaged from the transaxle to lift it out the top. And, you know, whenever he finally went to the shop manual, he found out you were supposed to pull the whole engine cradle and all. And that's the way a lot of these are nowadays. Ever since the first time I remember seeing that was on the Ford Aerostars, where you were supposed to drop the whole engine cradle with the suspension parts and everything out from under there. But all he had to do was just pay attention to what the shop manual says, read it first, and that's what I always like to do. If I'm doing a big job I hadn't done before, I like to go and look and see what it is that needs to be done, because sometimes you'll save yourself a lot of trouble that way. Now there's other times when you don't, well, like for example, I had to pull the differential carrier out of an Escort. It was a brand new car that had quit shifting, and because I had to replace that little plastic gear over there that drives the governor and the drive gear that was on the differential. And I noticed that the book said you had to pull the transaxle and take it apart to do that. And this is a warranty job, and I was working at Lincoln Mercury at the time, back in 1984. And I said, I think I can get that thing out of there by just pulling this bearing carrier out the end and dropping it out the bottom. And I did. I managed to get it out of there. And sometimes just giving it a try won't hurt anything, because if it doesn't work, you can kind of cobble it back together and then pull the transaxle. Well, I finished that job in about an hour and a half, got it all put back together, and the service manager questioned the amount of time it took me to do it, because it paid 6 hours to do that, and I had done it in an hour and 45 minutes, and everything was done right. It just wasn't done according to the shop manual. And so, anyway, that just got to let your judgment be your guide, but don't get yourself in trouble. One of the things he did do, this guy, there was a little aluminum bracket over on one end of the engine that he broke, that had to be ordered, but it wasn't but $15, you know. So anyway, he managed to beat this one, got it done, and all that. Now, this next one was a Kia Sedona. Actually belonged to my son, and he brought it down here and left it because the air conditioner was making horrible noise. And we hadn't worked on one of these particular vehicles here before. And we were going to put an expansion valve on it while we were replacing the compressor, and we also like put a dryer on there and all that, you know. But this particular one and I don't know if All Data still says this or not, but I was using All Data back then. This, I had seen other Asian vehicles over the years that like to put the expansion valve inside here. And that's where it said this one was. It even has an illustration of it, when actually the expansion valve is out here where it's fairly easy to get to. As a matter of fact, these two little posts are what goes, you know, what it goes on. But why they pictured it in here, unless there's something I don't know, that's not where it is. But the illustrations all have it in there. Now why they needed that out here, I don't know, but you can tell if you look at it that this is even designed, unless they had a little manifold pipes that had the low and the, you know, the liquid line and the low suction line hooking up to there. But anyway, to be perfectly honest, it would be stupid to put the expansion valve in here when you could put it out here. Somebody must have, there must be an early illustration at all that I got or something. But anyway, because my guys went by the shop manual, they wound up pulling the dash most of the way out of this thing before we realized that the expansion valve was not where the shop manual said it was. That was extremely annoying. And so we went ahead to replace the compressor too. And what happened there when we went to replace the compressor was that the aftermarket compressor, the first one, didn't fit. See, the original one looked like this. See how that's configured. The one that they sent, the first one they sent, was supposed to fit that, but there was no way on earth the suction line would go on it, because there was a bend in the suction line that, because of the way the thing was made, it wouldn't go down and go flush. And so I had to get them to get me another one, and it turned out this one was a perfect fit. It worked just like it was supposed to. So I don't know what this was actually supposed to fit, or if they just figured maybe that'll work and put it out there with the part number on it, or what. But that was a stuck on stupid thing. That's basically the theme of this video, is stuck on stupid, you know, because there was a lot of stuck on stupid that went on everywhere in this particular set of jobs that I'm talking about. Okay. Well, this Cobalt was one that we had originally seen that was, when the first time it came to us, it was running rough. And this sweet little old gal, she had a pretty good bit of money. I'm not exactly sure where she got the money she had. I think she got some kind of a cash settlement from a car accident or something, I don't know. But she was just as sweet as she could be. And she went over to this local tire store over there about 30 miles away. And she said, wanted them to see if they could fix it because it was running so bad. I mean, this thing was running horrible. It was, you know, wouldn't hardly idle and all that. And so she, when she brought the car to me, she says, they didn't fix it over there. They just put a set of spark plugs in it and charged me $500 and something. And I thought, who in the world could look somebody in the eye after putting 4 spark plugs in and doing nothing else and charging them $500? But that particular shop tended to do stuff like that, with all due respect to everybody involved. So I had one of my guys, I said, see why this thing's running rough? It's already had the spark plug replaced. And so he got out there, and within about 15 minutes he found a vacuum leak. I mean, a pretty good sized one. And I don't remember, it was a split hose or something, but he took care of it, and it ran just as smooth as silk after that. That's all it needed, was a vacuum leak fixed. But I said, we need to test drive it and make sure there's not any other problems. Well, when we test drove that darn thing, it had a sound, a noisy front hub bearing that was so noisy, you wouldn't have made any more noise if you had a gasoline powered weed eater holding it in the right front floorboard, you know, operating as, I mean, it was absolutely that loud. What that told me was the people at the tire store, after they put the spark plugs in it, never drove the car down the road, or they would have heard this and they would have certainly sold her a bearing. So what we wound up doing was we put her a bearing on there. Big old, that bearing was, you know, didn't cost all that much. I don't know, I think it was $140 or something, but we popped it on there. She was happy, drove away, tickled pink. All right, that was the first time we saw it. The next time we saw it was more serious. and I've mentioned this before, but I'm giving you a little bit more detail this time around. She was driving down the road and hit something in the road. She told me she thought it was a stick. Her boyfriend was with her, and he goes, he told her he thought it was a stick, but it turned out it was a piece of rebar. I don't know who figured that out, unless it was jammed up in here. But you see that it knocked a hole in the oil pan. All the oil got gone. I've often worried about plastic oil pans that they were using on some vehicles for a while. On a cold day, if a rock hits one of those, you know, you're going to bust it open and I'll lose all your oil. But when we pulled the pan off of it, we saw this cooked rod. You can tell it burnt that rod. There were the bearings for that rod. That's what the crankshaft looked like. And the cam saddle, it was wiped out too. You know, and so, but interestingly, there was only one of these rods that was burned out like this. The rest of them weren't. So there's, you know, technically you could put a crankshaft kit in it, but you're going to have to get a cylinder head because there's no way you're going to be able to fix this. No way I know of. And so we just ordered her another engine from the parts store. I used to buy stuff directly from LKQ because they had a kind of a local warehouse that was down the road. But that warehouse moved, and so I started having to go through my parts supplier, which I was using Advanced Auto Parts in that little town where the college was. And they got me an engine from LKQ, and it had a year's guarantee on it. You know, the best thing about putting a used engine in instead of doing a rebuild is if something happens to when you rebuilt, then you're going to have to eat the repair next time around if you've got any integrity. LKQ will cover it under warranty. One time we put an engine in a 99 F-150 that had locked up because of some kind of oil pressure issue, and they wanted a crate engine, so we got a crate engine from Ford for about $3,000 and put it in there, and it had a 3-year 36,000 mile warranty, just like it was a new, you know, the engine was just like it was in a new truck. Anyway, we got this, and the deal on that was this engine swap. The two engines were a little bit different. You can see here, it wasn't really a problem, but you can tell they were very similar, but there was some slight differences here. And see this right here? See how that's different from what was right here? However, it wasn't a deal breaker. And whenever I got another engine from the salvage yard, I always like to pull the flywheel off and replace the rear main seal, you know, the crankshaft seal in the back. Not a bad idea to replace one in the front. Two, I like to pull the valve cover off in the oil pan and see if there's sludge in there. Because the thing about it is that you can look at the outside of the engine, but you're not going to be able to tell if there's sludge in there. So we pull the pan, we pull the valve cover. If there's sludge in there, we clean it out the best way we can. And then we put it all back together with a pan gasket, a valve cover gasket. We got a new crank seal, and all of it, we're going to put new oil and coolant and all that kind of thing in it. And so, you know, we actually have had some that we found a lot of sludge in there, and if there was too much sludge and I thought it was going to cause a problem for the customer, I would have the salvage yard or LKQ or whoever bring me another motor. Now, dealing with a local salvage yard was easier because he didn't ask a lot of questions. He just brought you another engine. LKQ wanted to know every last little detail. And after we put this motor in there and it left and they were gone for, you know, she graduated from the program she was attending at the college, and her and her boyfriend brought the car back over there, and they said, hey, this motor quit. And I said, well, let me see what's going on with it. And I went out and the sliders on the timing chain and all that had come apart, and it jumped time and all that. And so I got a hold of the parts store. He pulled up his records. He said, you had 1 day left to do this. He said, but because you called me today, and I sent pictures and all to him that he could send to LKQ, I told the boyfriend, I said, you're going to have to swap that motor out because she no longer qualifies to have work down here, but I will get you an engine, but I need you to bring me the old engine. And so he got it out of there and brought it up there. And when LKQ came to deliver the replacement engine, I had the engine that had crapped out sitting there waiting for him. We put it on a pallet, and the guy took it. And so they lucked out on that. The boyfriend went and he put the motor back in it and all. So that worked out pretty well for her. But what was funny was my students came over there, and you know, we had taken the crankshaft seal out of this motor, and whenever they said, "This is the wrong crankshaft seal," and I said, "Really?" And I got to comparing it, and sure enough, it looked like it was wrong. And I went back and forth on the phone with the parts guy about it for a while, until finally I got my flashlight and looked at an angle on that thing. The seal they brought me that they said was the old seal for the Cobalt, turned out it was for a 91 F-150 we had in there that we had changed out the seal on. And they just picked up the wrong seal and compared the new one with the wrong seal. Stuck on stupid. And you know, me too. So anyway, by the time the smoke cleared, it turned out the seal he sent the first time was the right one. And they just screwed up by picking up because it was laying back there on a bench right by where we were doing the job on the Cobalt. Duh. Anyway, we took care of that. That was downright comical. All right. This Mazda 626, I'm showing you on this Honda Passport, it was making a rattling noise and blowing on one of my students, and it turned out that that tensioner, which is not supposed to bounce like that, it's supposed to be stiffer, was doing that same thing on this Mazda 626. We had previously cleaned the fuel system, put a fuel pump in it and stuff. But one of my students, and of course, what I'm always telling them is don't turn the engine backwards. I mentioned this before, if it's a timing belt or a timing chain, you're really subject to cause yourself a lot of trouble if you decide to turn that engine backwards with a socket on the crank bolt, because you can cause one to jump time doing that. And one of my students actually did that when they were checking this Mazda 626, and I mean, he actually felt it go boom boom and jump a couple of teeth. Well, it probably wouldn't have been quite so prone to jump a couple of teeth, but the tensioner was just like the one I showed you in this video. It was just loose and bouncing, which they do that. It's basically a stiff sort of it's like a super strong, something kind of like a hood support, you know what I mean, except it's real strong, and you got to press it in with the vise really slowly. And you might notice that little hole right there. It's in the housing and it's in the plunger, and whenever you push it all the way down on the new one, it comes that way. But if you're having to put one back, you got to squeeze it with the vise really slow and careful, and then stick something in like a drill bit. You know, it's something that's got to be really, really strong. And then after you mount the tensioner, then you pull that drill bit or whatever you put in there out, because the drill bit's strong enough to hold it. You know, a lot of paper clip or something like that's not going to hold it, because I tell you, that thing is seriously strong. But anyway, they got a kit like this with it. Came with a tensioner, and all the pulleys and the water pump and that kind of thing, and we got that Mazda going again. But okay, so then we had a starter issue. Listen to this.
All right, give it some juice. Oh, man, we got a good strong battery and a really lousy starter. Bad. Goes on this 97. Big difference in those two starters.
See, whenever we bench tested the starter, he had originally put another starter on it. And that other starter that he put on there, the first starter died. He put another starter on there. It died the same way. It was spinning real slow and, you know, kind of half burned up. So we bought a new starter from the parts store, or a rebuilt one or whatever, and put it on there. And at first it seemed to work okay, but it didn't really seem to spin as fast as it should. And before very long, that starter was fried too, and it didn't take very long at all. All right, now you might think, well, voltage drop, you know, because low voltage going to a starter because of voltage drop issues will burn a starter up in a big way, because I've seen that more times than one. If it doesn't get enough voltage or current down there, it's like you're overworking a motor and it's locked up, and it just cooks the windings in it. But this one here didn't have an appreciable amount of voltage drop on the positive or the negative side. But it did have voltage drop somewhere else. And boy, was that a surprise. Okay, what we had here was we had these contactors, and this is a contactor, it was contacting very slowly. The thing is supposed to snap in really hard, just like you see there. But basically what it was doing is it was going slow when it went in there, and it wasn't snapping in like it was supposed to. And the reason it was going slow and not snapping in, because it was dropping voltage between the battery terminal and that starter. If it was not getting enough power, it could energize that. There's a pull-in coil and a hold-in coil. It could energize that thing, but it wasn't snapping that contact against those two terminals, which basically the power comes from the battery. And whenever that contact snaps, the power goes through here into the motor, right? But it requires a good strong quantity of voltage and current, real crisp bite coming in there. There was voltage being, see, this is illustrating, about 4.5 volts that were being dropped. Now you got to remember, when we first saw this car, it came out of a barn, and I was telling this guy that said the voltage drop could be in any of the connectors at the ignition switch, the neutral safety switch, the wiring, or whatever. And so I had noticed that when we first put the third new starter on it, the final new starter, that when we tried to spin it over with the key, it wouldn't spin quite right, but I could arc across it with my screwdriver and it would just go wing, just like it did on a bench. That's what told me there was voltage drop there. And whenever I conferred with this guy, he decided to go ahead and put a push button on it that went, connected from the battery directly to this, bypassing all of this. So what he would do is he would turn on the key and he would push the button to start it. So he had him a push button start there, and that took care of the problem. It never burnt the starter up again. This is the terminal right here that actually energizes the solenoid. This is the one coming from the battery, and you can see how that was going into the starter. From battery, motor feed terminal is that big one down here, and the primary solenoid terminal is not really illustrated very well here, but there it is on this side. So anyway, I thought you might find that one pretty interesting there. All right. This rendezvous no start belonged to one of the English instructors from the other campus, and she said we went to 2 different shops because this thing, a lot of the times it just won't start, and sometimes it doesn't run quite like it ought to. And both shops put fuel pumps in it. The first shop put a fuel pump in it. The second shop put a fuel pump in it. But what we found, I pulled the relay whenever we caught it not starting, which is really handy if you can catch it not starting at the shop. Did my test light trick, hooked the test light to positive, touched it very gently to the terminal that goes out to the pump. There should be a ground there, as long as you're not going through a fuel pump control module or something. This one wasn't. And this is what we discovered. The fuel pump relay, we touched it here, we got no ground. See, we ought to see a ground coming all the way through here. We didn't get one, and the problem was right here at pin F12. Now somebody had tinkered with this before, because you saw that brown wire with the heat shrink on it, and but see, the terminal, there was voltage dropping, and there was resistance because of it, and it scorched terminal F12. You can see the numbers F12, that's the way these things are numbered. And there was the wire that plugged into it that was going out to the fuel pump. And so what we did was, we went ahead and I got from a salvage yard, I got the right junction box, like a fuse box, and it came with connectors. All the wires had been cut and all that. And so we were able to replace the junction box with one that was in pristine shape, and we actually disconnected the terminal. We actually replaced this terminal with a new one from the new fuse box connector and all that too. I kept that fuse box for a long time and let students do exercises finding where the pin went through and all that. But anyway, I thought that was a very interesting set of circumstances there that we had. And okay, now then, all three of these stuck in stupid jobs went to shop at the same time. There's your 626, there's your Cobalt, and there's the Kia Sedona. Now the Rendezvous was parked on the other side, and it wasn't really a stuck on stupid job, not on our end of it anyway. Maybe the two shops that both put fuel pumps in it and gave up on it after that. I don't know about those people. I don't know who did that either. Here's another little random thing here. Random item of interest. We had this Escort wagon. The parts guy used to have his parts delivery man delivering parts on these local parts house over here. And it was a junky little standard shift Escort. And so he was getting rid of it because he was getting a better vehicle for his parts guy to drive. And I used some of my department funding to buy that car from him for $400. And boy, I had so much fun with that car. And I taught the kids how to drive standard shift and pull up on the lift with it. And we had to replace the clutch a few times because they would destroy the clutch, you know, the ones that didn't know how to drive a stick. And that thing right there was one of the most useful trainer cars I ever had. The odd thing about it was, if you let it sit out there for very long and let the gas start to go bad, it wouldn't even start until you replace the gas. And I'm not talking about a long time either. But when the gas was a little bit rotten, this thing wouldn't start at all. And that would be the only problem it would have. And that was a good troubleshooting exercise for the students too, because they'd find fuel, they'd find spark, they'd find compression and all that. Well, I told one of them, I said, why don't we let you do an in-frame overhaul on this Escort? You know, bought rings and bearings and all that. Pan comes off, timing belts comes off, head comes off. And he found the cylinder wall looking like this. Now, you know, for any of us that has built engines, this is a kiss of death. You know, you either got to get it bored and sleeved or something, you know, or just bored 30 thousandths with new pistons. Of course, rebuilding a motor is best to bore it 30 thousandths, put new pistons in it anyway, because the holes are almost never round if it's got very many miles on it. You don't want good round holes that aren't tapered. Anyway, I told him, I said, just go ahead and put that thing back together. I said, trainer car anyway, it ain't gonna matter. So he put it back together, and it was surprising to us that it didn't foul the spark plug, and it had pretty doggone good compression on that cylinder, and it seemed to run okay, even with this garbage cylinder wall that we found. All right. This is one of several ways a head gasket can fail. I had found this picture, it's a really good one. This is called the fire ring by the people that make head gaskets, and this is where the fire ring failed. Now there are a bunch of different ways head gaskets can fail. I may do a total video on that one time, but this particular fire ring failed and it was letting compression leak. See, if the compression is leaking into the coolant, it'll cause the engine to overheat. But there's, you know, like I say, there's a bunch of different ways that head gaskets can fail. And I've always wondered about people that as soon as they open the hood, they started yelling blown head gaskets. You know, you can fall in a trap like that. Talked about that a little bit last time. Now, a really good way to find a parasitic drain with an inductive meter is like this. Just go around either one of those. This is a General Technologies amp clamp that I've got. It's a really nice one. Incidentally, they don't advertise it, but you can connect those two leads to a scope and get a pattern using this one, believe it or not. But one way or another, it was reading 0.8. More than 50 millivolts. See, this is 8/10 of I'm sorry, amps, not volts. This is 8/10 of an amp. If it's more than 50 milliamps, it's enough to kill the battery within a couple of days. And so just, you know, keep that in mind. But that right there is a neat little tool that I carry with me. Well, that's Bobby sitting in the Cadillac. This is the end of this video, and I really appreciate you guys tuning in. And y'all come back now, and let's be careful out there. You hear?